Hello. Hopefully the audio will be okay. It's been a very interesting, exciting, turbulent few days in Zimbabwe, and I think it does make an interesting change from the usual news focus, which tends to be focused on the Middle East as a region. So now we're seeing a news story where an African country is dominating the headlines, and that isn't always the case. But the overwhelming sentiment seems to be a positive one. I left a comment on the BBC News report earlier saying that I wish Zimbabweans well, and that Mugabe had tried to make out Britain to be the enemy in his tenure, and that wasn't the case. And I got 19 likes for that from black Zimbabweans, and I know that because I've checked the profiles. So this is an interesting response. I always assumed that when Mugabe's time finally came, whether it be from a cause like this. In fact, I didn't think this would happen. I think he would just stay in power until he died. And I thought it would be a case of there'd be sort of defensive nationalism. That is often the way with dictators. Wherever you have a dictatorship, you have people willing to defend the dictator and say, oh, this is outside media interfering in our affairs and so on. But that hasn't been the case so much with this. And I think the reason for that is because this was very much an internal transition in the sense that the military certainly seem to have widespread support. It's been bloodless, which is a good thing, given the long history within African countries of violent overthrows of power. That in itself is a good thing. Um, I think it's too early to be very jubilant. If I was a Zimbabwean, I think I would feel very pleased, but I'd also feel a little bit cautious. Change always brings question marks. And Zimbabwe still faces huge problems from Mugabe's legacy. I mean, you don't get a dictator in power for 37 years without there being some negative legacy left over from that that's going to need to be cleared up. His disastrous economic policies, etc. Things I've already covered in the previous video. One thing I will say, it's interesting how history changes. I've been watching a 25-minute archive newsreel from 1980, the year that Mugabe took over. Then he was nominally prime minister, but to all extents and purposes, he had the real power until 1987 when he nominally became president. His ZANU PF party won, of course, in 1980. Um, Firstly, it's interesting seeing the different responses on the street at that time. The white minority were very nervous. One woman was even very angry, irate. She yelled at the BBC reporter, you bloody British have sold out to the Russians." And they were very nervous about it, a bit like, I guess, white South Africans when Mandela came to power. Um, black Zimbabweans at the time were obviously mainly pleased about Mugabe's victory. They saw this as a great victory for Pan Africanism, for African nationalism, and so on. Now, what's interesting is at the time, Mugabe was interviewed by British journalists. He had been a teacher, he had taught within prison. He came across, quite honestly, as reflective, intelligent, even conciliatory. At one point, and this was very interesting, he said he didn't want a white minority to leave Zimbabwe and he didn't want any reverse racialism. Robert Mugabe, wind the clock on 20, 30 years, and you see a very different Mugabe. You see a very arrogant demagogue, an egomaniac, a man who held lavish birthday celebrations whilst his people were really, really struggling. And it's a classic case of power going to someone's head. Mugabe could have been a great man. He could have been another Mandela. Instead, he ended up as another Idi Amin. Perhaps not quite as bad in terms of sheer figures. Amin killed up to 500,000. Mugabe's toll still horrendous. 20,000 people in Matabele land and thousands more tortured and imprisoned. Um, but the point is, he went down that line. And instead of being the conciliatory figure that he alluded to, he ended up a vicious racist. forcing elderly white farmers off the land, brutalizing their black employees, a complete demagogue. And now his time is up. And Mugabe is, by my count, the fifth dictator to come to an end within this decade. There was Ben Ali in Tunisia, Salah in Yemen, Mubarak in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya, and now Mugabe. Now, the reaction between Mugabe's departure and Gaddafi's is interesting. Gaddafi, of course, died a violent death in the midst of a brutal civil war. And there's still a lot of sentiments against the West for that the West engineered it. Russian state propaganda really sows up animosity towards the West for that one. I happen to believe that Gaddafi done some terrible things, and his removal in itself was a good thing. Libya, of course, is not. It's hardly a beacon of democracy right now, but people would do well to remember some of the things that Gaddafi done. Um, the problem with dictators is people, where there is sometimes reforms that seem to stabilize a country, people then whitewash the negative. Uh, Muammar Gaddafi was an evil man. This was a man who had the blood of 270 people, Lockerbie victims on his hands. This was a man who tortured prison inmates. This was a man who um, saw himself as a living god. So it really irritates me when people get into revisionism and they point fingers at, for example, the West, when it was the Libyans themselves that overthrew Gaddafi, and it was the Libyans themselves who actually cheered Cameron and Sarkozy on the streets of Benghazi. These are facts. These are facts that can be seen in archive footage from the time. But every country is different, and what happened in Libya may be very different in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, like I say, it was entirely internal. There wasn't any outside intervention. Um, and so far it's been bloodless, and I hope it stays that way. The good news is it doesn't look like Mugabe's got any support. So it doesn't look like there's going to be some sort of counter coup or anything like that. That's a good thing. That means, in all likelihood, we're not going to see bloodshed in Zimbabwe. But what is critical is that whoever takes over, whether it be an interim military government um, or whoever succeeds, that they respect the human rights of all Zimbabweans and that they don't make the mistake of Mugabe and end up replacing one dictator with another. What I was thinking of is when Milton Obote was toppled in Uganda, there were celebrations there, and a certain general who had served in the British Army, who had been a boxer, and who was a charismatic figure, one Idi Amin, came to power. And we all know what a nightmare that turned into. Um, so that is why we need to be a little bit cautious with this. Mugabe was a brutal tyrant. He's gone, and that should be celebrated. But the people of Zimbabwe deserve a transition now to genuine democracy and a progressive country that really does respect the human rights of all of its citizens. And this is not me preaching as an outsider. This is what I've seen. This is what Zimbabweans themselves have said. So I really, really hope that country can see a positive future. And it's interesting times. This is historic. Mugabe has got what he deserved. He's been brutalizing his people for long enough. Um, it may be that they need to show him a certain degree of leniency for the sake of conciliation, if he does have any supporters. But certainly, he does not deserve to be in power. So I'll leave it there. If you're a Zimbabwean, I'd like to know your thoughts. And I genuinely, genuinely wish that country all the best. Thanks for watching.